Here we go. Our first writer is Jane E. Hendrick, who lives in Southwest Virginia, the mountains, after a lifetime spent in prairie, delta, and river bottom country. She's learning how to live a life of solitude afforded by the shelter of the mountains. Here's our first writer then, Jane Hendrick, and her poem, Shelter of the Mountains.
Shelter of mountains. Prairie sister said, I feel hemmed in. Seattle friend said, these are not real mountains. These mountains are old and worn, once grand as Alps, wave after wave of ancient stone lapped primal shores. Land of blue mist, revered as spirit by natives who named them Appalachia, people who bring light. Few understand these mountains shelter her. They hold her when no other would. They bring her light.
I want to correct an oversight. One of our judges is here. I wanted you to meet him. And he judged the prose this time. His name is Robin Olnut, and Robin is seated right over there. Thank you, Robin. Appreciate your being here. Our next writer, Victoria Mencio, has been a Blacksburg resident for 24 years. She received her Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from the University of Texas and worked to reclaim mine land. And along with her husband, she raised 2 boys. She's now using her time to write. One of her works in progress is a fictionalized autobiography, which is presented as a modern-day Little Women. She'll be reading an excerpt from that today. Here's Vicki Mencio and Frayed and Fractured.
Prologue. Since the death of my mother, my family has been in tatters. I can't understand it except to say that our mother must have been the thread that held us together. It was an invisible thread whose existence we were unaware of and whose importance completely escaped us until now. My mother's death fractured our sisterhood, which was once so dear to us. It's quite astounding to me that my mother could have had such an impact on our lives and emotions, even though we were all grown and hadn't felt the need to be mothered in a long time, especially since most of us were occupied being mothers ourselves. In fact, her last year with us should have prepared us for the loss we feel now, but that didn't happen. I now realize it is impossible to really prepare for the unknown. Even though my mother's death was the event that fractured our sisterhood, there were many existing fissures that contributed. Looking back over the years, I can see how time, distance, and circumstance all played a role. Maybe my mother's passing was just the excuse some of us needed or used to walk away. I like to tell myself that this damage to our union is temporary, that it is part of the grieving process. But another part of me knows I'm deluding myself. How can a broken Ming vase ever be put back together again? The romantic and the realist in me are always dueling it out. The realist seems to be winning. But I am confident that in the end the romantic will win. After all, isn't that the point of dementia? Since I currently feel so disconnected from my sisters, I'm constantly thinking about a time when we were a strong unit, held together by love and blood, and no one and nothing had the power to come between us. Our defining time was the early 70s, our coming of age, so to speak. And not just because of our ages and the discovery of who we were as people, but because of the circumstances of our family, though not unique, were of great importance to us. Chapter 1, Little Women. My sisters and I were as much like the sisters of Louise May Alcott's Little Women as sisters could be, except the bulk of our childhood took place in Texas during the 1970s, instead of the existentialist Northeast of the 1870s. And as you may recall, Alcott described her Little Women as having existed on the lower fringe of society. And it took place during the Civil War. We had a war to contend with too, Vietnam, and grew up in the lower middle class, so we had to do without on occasion. The March girls had their well-meaning aunt to help, and we had our grandmother and her 2 unmarried sisters. Dad was military and Mom stayed home. We traveled from base to base like many military families. I remember Dad being gone most of the time. In fact, when he was home, it was kind of like having a relative visit. Mom, like many military wives, ran the household on every level. Dad was a loud, passionate, affectionate Italian man who liked to hug and kiss and call us by silly nicknames. He loved spicy food and introduced me to my first taste of hot sauce, a slightly traumatic incident at the time, but which has probably contributed greatly to my sharing a love of spicy food with my dad and my own children. I remember Mom confiding in me as an adult married woman that Dad's passionate nature extended to the bedroom. That didn't surprise me at all, especially since I remember as a child climbing into my parents' big king-size bed at night when I needed their comfort from a bad dream and finding Dad sleeping naked. Lucky for me, he slept like the dead and didn't seem to mind sharing Mom after he went to sleep. However, I'm sure However, I'm not sure he wanted the consequences of his lovemaking as much as the actual lovemaking itself. But Mom was a good Catholic girl, so he didn't have a choice in the matter. He used to tell stories about himself I later learned were falsehoods. Looking back, he sometimes did seem like a guy with something to prove. Each of us sees Dad's different peculiarities as negatives. Some think his strong emotions were negative, and others the lies. But we each carry some of these characteristics in varying degrees. For me, I don't like the falsehoods, and I strive always to be truthful. I'm of course aware that truth can be hurtful, even though my sisters probably think I don't know that sometimes. I try to soften the truth as much as my patience will allow. I have one sister who uses falsehoods more freely than Dad did, and it's a constant source of aggravation for me. In 1969, Dad requested a transfer back to his and Mom's hometown of San Antonio, Texas. Soon after returning, he took early retirement and started his own business. Dad didn't turn out to be a great businessman. The lack of a steady income put stress on my parents, which no doubt was instrumental in their eventual divorce in 1974. That marked a huge change in our family, not because our circumstances physically changed much, but we realized that the family unit we thought was permanent wasn't. If my parents could decide they didn't love each other anymore, didn't that mean that they could stop loving us? Dad married 5 times in his life. The first wife was to my half-sister's mom, who died in childbirth. The second wife was a fill-in mom, and it was a civil marriage. I mention it was a civil marriage because he divorced her and could still go on to marry Mom in the church. The church didn't recognize civil marriage or divorce, so the second marriage was ignored by them. Then he married Mom, the longest marriage he had except for marriage number 5. Marriage 5 was the one he needed the annulment for, because that woman wanted to be married in the church. An annulment meant that the marriage never existed in the eyes of the church. Mom took umbrage over that and tried to contest it. She said an annulment would mean that the children would be illegitimate in the eyes of the church, so Dad shouldn't do it. But the men of the church allowed it, which broke Mom's heart. After all, she was the dedicated Catholic, not Dad. With her Catholic school background all the way through college and her dedication to the local nuns. Her mother even worked full-time for the church for less than minimum wage. I think they were punishing Mom for getting a divorce. Father McDonald paid many visits to us during the days before the divorce, trying to convince her not to go through with it, because it would mean excommunication for her. She respected that and never took communion again after the divorce. Through all that drama, Dad still loved Mom. He called at least once a year, asking her to take him back, even though he was almost always married to someone else at the time. And after the divorce, Mom went to work as an English teacher in a Catholic elementary school. It was thought public school teachers didn't make a living wage. Well, I can assure you that Catholic elementary school teachers in San Antonio made much less and had no benefits. I remember hearing a lot of "we can't afford it" from my mom growing up. It's why I deliberately try not to use that with my children. They can see I'm very thrifty. My name is Vivian, usually called Viv by my family. But my mom often used my full Vivian Lee when calling me. Jo Marsh is the heroine of Little Women. I'm hesitant, mostly due to modesty, to say that she's the character I most closely am related to, but I must, if only because the actual writing of this story is done by me. But the similarities don't stop there. I'm similar to Jo in personality, actions, and even birth order. Jo Marsh was a tomboy, and I was the only athlete of all my sisters. Not an athlete by the standards held by athletes, but by my family. I don't think I ever saw my sisters sweat. I have a strong will and a rebellious nature, just like Jo Marsh. I broke away from the pack and went off to university in the hopes of achieving a financial independence my mom had worked so hard for. I felt and still feel strong feminist impulses to be free-thinking and independent, even though I realized that my partnership with my husband undermines some of that. I even mimicked Jo in that I married a foreigner, like she did. Her German immigrant, Professor Friedrich Fritz Baer, and my Lebanese immigrant, Professor Zachariah Zach Verhot. My husband's close-knit Lebanese family gives me back that feeling I had growing up in San Antonio, surrounded by extended family with all the love, fighting, headaches, and security it brings. It serves as an example to me of what family should be and helps me to embrace my sometimes painful past. My oldest sister, the eldest, Cynthia, is like the eldest Marsh sister, Meg. Meg Marsh was interested in her future and in having nice things. She dreamt of being the lady of the house, where she would raise her polite children. Cindy is only slightly older than I am, 11 months. So we lived much as twins do. In fact, in the Catholic community, we were what was referred to as Irish twins. We shared a bedroom until she moved out at 18. We did most activities together, such as being Girl Scouts, learning to sew, and taking guitar lessons. Cindy was always babysitting to make money so she could buy nice things and escape poverty that way. She went to work during high school in a co-op program that allowed students to go to a job part of the school day and then straight into a full-time job after graduation. While I was away at university, we stayed close and in touch through letter writing and many visits home, where I would stay with her at her apartment. She had high hopes of marrying well like Meg, but like Meg, she married for love. Our third sister, Melanie, is our Beth March, the quiet, content sister. But since our Beth lived, she eventually lost her quiet demeanor, found her voice, and became quite a woman. Melanie always had a smile on her face and was warm and giving. Melanie is to me like Beth was to Jo, the glue that is now holding me to my family of sisters. Without her, whatever fragments that we have shattered into would blow away. And last but not least is our Amy, Jacqueline, Jackie, the self-centered youngest child, who was a tornado of a girl ripping through our lives, but who started out as the often left out and dragged along baby. I was a poor substitute for a mother for her most of the time, and she grew up to resent me for it. Not that that was the only reason for her resentment, but it set up a pattern between us that exists to this day. So that's us, the four Montanaro sisters. We've tried to stay close, but adults aren't as forgiving as children. We hold on to hurts, even nurture them, until they strain our relationships to the point of unraveling. I pray these relationships are still held by a thread that will never break. Chapter 2, Peter Pan. In the early 70s in San Antonio, Texas, summers were long and spent outdoors. We had virtually no adult supervision. The divorced moms were at work all day, and the others were inside shopping or visiting. Either way, we were expected to entertain ourselves, which we did happily. We stayed outside, building forts and tree houses, exploring the woods behind our house, skating around the neighborhood, bike riding, playing hide and seek and tag. We'd go around searching the roadside for glass bottles to return for their 5-cent deposits at the local convenience store, which we called an ice house. I guess it's a throwback from the days before air conditioning, when people purchased ice more regularly. The man who worked at the convenience store never looked happy when we came in with our black and bare feet and dirty bottles to exchange them for penny candy. But his attitude could never damper our enthusiasm. We stayed out till the streetlights came on, and sometimes later. Our friend Samantha's mom would usually be the one to wrap things up by calling her in to dinner. And sometimes, if calling didn't work, chasing Samantha home with a ruler in her hand. But on Sundays, we didn't need to be called twice, because we would run home to watch The Wonderful World of Disney. The television only had 4 channels back then. WW of Disney was one of our favorite shows. One Sunday, we saw Sandy Duncan fly through the air as Peter Pan, and an idea was born that stuck with us. We decided to put on a garage play. Our first of many grand productions was Peter Pan, which included flying, of course. My sisters and I threw ourselves wholeheartedly into the production of this play. We made costumes and sets and invited everyone in the neighborhood. I wrote the script and engineered the flying contraption, while Cindy was the production manager. I was to stand off stage, helping my sisters with their lines, while also controlling the rope that made the cast fly. Melanie was our Peter Pan, because of that great smile and charisma, but mainly because of her weight. I was able to pull her up on the rope I had thrown over the rafters. Cindy was Wendy because she insisted on being the girl. And we recruited our neighbor Samantha and her younger brother to be John and Michael, who didn't have speaking roles. We were nervous and excited as the driveway filled up with all the children of the neighborhood. We lived in one of those neighborhoods which had 2 to 10 children per house, 2 or 3 in the Protestant houses, and 4 to 10 in the Catholic. I felt so proud. I was expecting a huge success, and it was a success, but not in the way I thought it would be. Our first scene took place in the Darling family nursery, and we used our beloved, usually calm basset hound Buster as the dog Nana. Everything was going along splendidly until Peter/Melanie showed up and demonstrated how he could fly. Most of the children sprang up out of their seats and rushed the stage, all wanting to try it. Our dog Buster started barking at all the commotion and had to be taken off stage and returned to the backyard. We tried to get everyone to sit down and wait for the play to be over by telling them they would be able to fly afterwards and that we still had fairies and pirates to come. It was a huge disappointment not to be able to show off the costumes we'd worked so hard on. The fairy costumes had beautiful translucent wings, which we made using wire hangers and gauze. The pirate costumes had sashes and swords and eye patches. We even had a skull and crossbones flag for the ship. Captain Hook had an aluminum foil-covered piece of tree branch that made the perfect hook, which had taken ages to find. But the audience wasn't having any of it. The rowdier boys took up fighting with the pirate swords while they waited for their turn to float through the air. So our first garage production lasted all of 1 scene, and the flying lasted until the rope frayed and broke.
Our next writer is Jeff Saperstein, and he characterizes himself as an Appa Yankeean. He spent the first half of his life in New York, New England, and the second half in the New River Valley. Recently retired from the English department at Radford University, he looks forward to the third half of his life. Jeff Saperstein and his poem, Bird Song.
Thank you, Tony. With apologies to ornithologists. Birdsong emerges from the thick morning mist in a myriad of meters and moods. Richie, Richie, Richie. Tss, tss, tss. Ho, 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 ho. Your attention flits from the warblers to the mockers to the melancholy mourners, whose coos are like a Kaddish, chanted in a distant tongue. What gets you is their persistence, their compulsion to repeat. Each is solitary, insistent, pitched at a different key. Whether chittered or hammered, dulcet or harsh, each harps on the one theme as if no other combination of tones could possibly carry the burden of their refrain. As the sun rises, as the air heats, you find no escape from the dissonant din.
Our next writer is Richard Bay. Patty Bay wrote this about her husband. He is an art professor at Radford University, and Richard Bay has had a number of experiences over his lifetime, from being the voice of a character on Creature Comforts by Aardman, to radio host in Kansas City, even painting signs for carnivals, as well as over 40 years of teaching art. Here is Richard Bay and his prose selection, Nana's Memory.
If you'd indulge me, I know it's not NPR. My 93-year-old mother is listening on the phone in New York, and I'd like to dedicate this to my past sister and to her mother, my Nana, Olga Fergan Wren. Nana's Memory. Decaying, yellowed afternoon light surrounds her. The building rooftops become shutters on theatrical fixtures, defining her area of illumination. Within the earthen-colored rebosa, the form moved. Shoulders, movements swelled the faded fabric. First the head, and then the neck appear from under the layered material. I stand and watch as arms emerge. Those graceful brown forms move upward and outward, stretching the fragile garment into what look like wings. The rebosa falls behind her. She seemed to shiver in the afternoon air. Her skin is an earthen brown. The bottoms of her feet are grayed from walking. Her hair is long, uneven in length, and a dull silver blue. Watching this old woman from a distance has stirred a childhood memory. I stood in the backyard of Nana's house. I was a curious child. I remember wandering through the backyard, drawn to the noxious odor of Nana's prized lilac bush. I looked over the bush's surface in the endless swelling of color. There in front of me, securely attached to one of the fragile branches, and in between the fragrant purple flowers, was an eggshell-colored, fuzzy-looking lump. My hands gently moved the blossoms so I could gaze at the finger-length sac. Standing there alone, inspecting this thing's shimmering surface, when without warning, the capsule moved. My hands lurched back from the branch. What had I awoken? Regaining my courage, my fingers again moved closer. Then I see a small black form pierce the velvety envelope. What appeared next were two fragile legs gripping the freshly torn edge of the wrapper. The creature pulled itself free from its prison. It seemed to shiver in the warm summer air. What I saw next defines beauty. Two elegant wings unfurled. They resembled lemon yellow lace outlined with black and crimson markings. The creature sits poised on its perilous perch, its wings gently starting to move. Then, with a sudden downward thrust of those delicate forms, the creature moved skyward. Floating up into the air, it circled my head and rode an afternoon breeze out of my view. The rebosa fell behind her. She seemed to shiver in the afternoon air. Her skin is brown. The bottoms of her feet are gray from walking. Her hair is long, uneven in length, a dull silver blue. I move closer. Her head turns towards me, and I see her eyes. Milky white without color or reflection. Within a step of her, I stoop down to look at her as she looks directly at me and says, "Buenos tardes, senor." I am unmirrored in the opaque titanium pools that are her eyes, yet she senses my presence. I respond to her greeting, wishing her a good afternoon. She carefully lifts a blanket in front of her, covering 3 small woven baskets, a fourth about half finished, stuffed with a pile of assorted colored reeds. Picking up the unfinished vessel, her hands become busy. Over, cross under, cross over, cross again, and twist the dark strand to keep the pattern migrating, circling around the container. Her hands seeing what her eyes can't. Once again, over, cross under, cross over, stopping momentarily, holding a strand between her thumb and forefinger. Her eyes meet mine again. Knowing she sees without eyes, knowing she sees me. Silence falls between us, broken by her fragile utterance. "Would you like to take a look at my work?" I say yes, and I pick up one of the baskets. They are precisely woven. The baskets are covered with an intricate colored pattern flowing over the contours, and there is not a strand out of place. How can this be? Nana said, as one sense diminishes, another takes its place. Nana came to live with us after Richard died, the same Richard I was named for. Her eyes had also grown tired of seeing, but what Nana couldn't see, she made up for with her acute hearing. Sitting there in the room down the hall from mine, there was the daily glare of her work lamp. My father fashioned it to help her sew. I really think it was to keep her upstairs. The combination of her thick lens glasses, that light, let her sit and stitch hour upon end. Over, cross under, cross over. The needle pulled the brilliantly colored thread through the material, making a beautiful and intricate pattern. Over, cross under. She sat there listening to Joe Franklin's Memory Lane, and when her hands grew weary, she would read from her giant print German Bible or Lutheran Witness devotional. She was attentive to all that surrounded her. She could tell when I would come by and up to my room and beckon me if she needed a part of a pattern outlined or a needle threaded. You see, my mom wrapped the arm of the worn chair with tape and foam rubber. Nana always started the day with a full complement of threaded needles and many colors of thread. She always had them organized, the lightest colors to the front, the darkest near her elbow. For fun, I would try to sneak up on my toes behind her, and she'd say in her gravelly German accent, "Why do you wish to scare me so?" Nana was especially wonderful to watch around my father. You see, she wasn't particularly fond of Joey, and if she heard her name even mentioned, she would instinctively turn up to hear it. His comments weren't always flattering, so Nana would listen, move closer to him, and then bombard him with suitable, colorful German rhetoric. Nana always said, one must respect age and wisdom. Looking at the woman in front of me, "Senora, please tell me, how do you know the colors?" One of her hands reaches down to the blanket in front of her. The other extends out toward me. At that moment, our fingers touched. She took my hand in hers and turned my palm upward. My lesson is about to begin. Fingers aged with experience move through the reeds scattered on the blanket in front of her. Her eyes never leave mine. She picks up a single strand, placing it in my open hand. She says, "Rosa." I look down to see a red reed resting in my hand. She repeats the lesson. Negro, black, ambra, yellow, natural, tan. I take her hand in mine. I say, "Senora, please, tell me, how do you know the colors?" She pulls her hand away and takes the reeds from my hand. Without a word, she goes back to work. Over, cross under, cross over. She looks up to see if I'm still there. She stares at me and says, "I can feel the color." Thinking, is that possible? Thinking, remembering what Nana had said about learning from age and wisdom. Thinking, I must open my mind to what is possible and learn to close my eyes. I must learn the beauty of nothing and explore its possibilities. I turn my hand skyward, I close my eyes. I hear her say, "Feel the fire of autumn." My fingers tingle with the warmth of this piece. My lips utter the word, "Rosa." I roll the strand of my fingers and a tear runs down my cheek. Her hand wipes the tear away and she says to me, "What have you learned?" I open my mind to see her holding the fragile vessel again. Over, cross under, cross over. Looking into my eyes, she says, "Adios, senor," and twists the dark strand.
Our next poem concerns the crisis that the writer experienced when he was 18 years of age and his mother took her own life. Its focus is on the comfort that he found in the midst of that crisis and still does. Here is Joe Womack and his poem, It Stayed.
This poem is in memory of a man named Jack Bradshaw, who was my father's closest friend and was the person that he called for in his worst moment of his life. It stayed. My mother dead, suddenly, tragically. My father bewildered. Questions came to him from friends gathered. What can we do for you? Anything we can get you? And then the one that stayed. Do you want anyone here? Quickly, my father responded, yes, Jack Bradshaw. The question and answer came and stayed with me, now 46 years later. Stayed because I heard my father's need. Stayed because of his friend. I still want to be a Jack Bradshaw.
Jack Hencke has been a special education teacher at Blacksburg High School since 1992, with previous stops in Maryland, California, and Ohio. Jack is the second of 7 children in his family, not considered a large family in his suburb of DC. But this prose piece is more about large families than DC. Here is Jack Hencke and his prose piece, Station Wagons.
A new one appeared about every 5 or 6 years as I was growing up. They always smelled so good. They were so beautiful. There was a Studebaker, the blue Chevy Impala, a tan, and then a brown Ford Country sedan. My folks drove them until they were no longer reliable or smelled very well. They were all station wagons. Wagon travel in the days before seatbelts was much different. Where a person got to sit was a major consideration. Window seats were, of course, generally more desirable than sitting in the middle. One actually wanted to sit, that is. Sitting was not the choicest position. Standing on the hump with your arms draped over the front bench seat was the most coveted position for we boys. One could see down the road as well as the driver. Mary, drugged out on Dramamine, was naturally sitting between Mom and Dad up front. In this position, Mary's state of car sickness could be monitored and medicated should any sign of consciousness be noted. I remember Mary's position involved some inconveniences. First, Mary might get walloped in the face when Dad threw out his arm to keep her there during an emergency application of the brakes. I had complete confidence in my dad's arm that he could protect anyone from being thrown through the windshield or into the dashboard. Didn't matter how fast we were going. It's amazing that Mary never received a broken nose. The second inconvenience was that the front seat was cluttered not only by an unconscious little girl, but also by Mary's plastic throw-up bucket, Mom's Washington, D.C. yellow pages. She was only 5'1", and she needed some help seeing over the dash whenever she took a turn. There were the AAA triptychs that would keep us on the Route 40 between St. Louis and Washington, D.C. There were water coolers, jugs, and other supplies that Mom had packed to keep her family happy for 2 12-hour days on the road. Tom, the eldest, usually rode the hump, unless he chose to manipulate his way into a more desired position. Seating was fairly fluid in those days. Tom might allow me to have the hump if I let him lie back in the baggage area with the suitcases maybe for a half an hour, or if he needed a window seat to wage war on Chris. Tom and Chris would stare out their opposite windows, noting how many guardrails, I think it represented artillery and fortifications of some sort, and long unkempt grass, which represented swarming infantry. They had some method to decide who was winning for every mile of the trip. Those trips to St. Louis were 2-day affairs. I know when we were all really young, my folks had tried once, driving through the night, but they had discovered that the 2-lane driving on Route 40, just 1 lane in each direction except for those rare passing lanes, was treacherous and complicated with 4 little ones, several of us in diapers. The trip became a 2-day affair with an incredibly luxurious feeling motel sleepover. Mom would always insist on the AAA rating. Making good time meant staying on the road as much as possible. Taking bathroom breaks whenever one of us needed to was a real hindrance. My parents had an easy solution: the cup. Dad, can we stop? I have to go pee. One of us would explain. Well, we just stopped 20 minutes ago. Why didn't you go then? I didn't need to. This kind of conversation had caused many miles of stress until my mom had handed one of us a cup. Pee in that, she had directed. We laughed ourselves silly. Pee in the cup. That's not a joke. Pee in the cup. This became a challenge. I think I might have been the first to attempt this, balancing in a standing position behind the front seat of a shaking car, trying to convince my brothers not to look, them promising to look out the window, and also sneaking peeks to see if it was possible. Holding the paper cup, trying to aim carefully, things were going great. My aim was good, the stretcher road was fairly smooth, the cup filled, I wasn't done. It's not big enough, it's gonna overflow. Mayhem broke out in the car. Stop peeing, Mom was shouting at me. I somehow managed to stop midstream. I was not very confident in my ability to maintain control. Pat, what size cup did you give him? My dad asked very unhelpfully. Do you want to shop for the supplies for the next trip, Paul? Mom snapped back at him. Don't spill that on me, Chris and Tom had both recoiled in horror. Tom, roll down your window quick, Mom directed. Why me? Why not Chris's side? Thomas, Paul, Dad spoke, and Tom's window was rolled down. Throw it out the window, Mom directed. I can't reach. I felt helpless, hopeless. The pee was pretty near the top, and by only sheer luck had I kept it from spilling. Tom, take the cup from Jack and dump it out the window. Dad was speaking up. There's a curve coming up ahead. I don't want to touch it. I think a few minor trickles had found their way down the sides. Thomas! Mom and Dad both directed. Tom snatched the cup, pitched it out the window. Pee exploded in the wind around the car, soaking the left side window of the baggage section. Wow, that was cool, Tom said. Did you see how the pee exploded and just kind of flattened out? The car behind us ran over the cup, Chris added. You were supposed to hold on to the cup, Mom added. She was horrified that we had littered the highway. I still have to pee, I shouted. I need a cup right now. Dad swerved a bit. I almost fell over, but Tom pushed me back up into an upright position. Mom was reaching around up front in the mess and produced a metal tumbler that was usually reserved for coffee. Use that, she directed as she handed it back to me. The tumbler worked great. It had more volume than the paper cups. Don't throw the cup away. Mom frantically shouted as Tom got ready to dump the contents. About an hour later, Mary woke up. "I have to go pee," she said. "Paul, there's a filling station up ahead there. Please pull over for Mary to use the bathroom." "What?" We boys were immediately aware of some unequal treatment going on. "Why are you stopping for debts?" That's what we called her. "You didn't stop for Jack?" "She's a girl. She can't pee in a cup." Mary seemed kind of preen as she strutted with Mom to the bathroom. As we started out again, and before Mary was reduced to a sleeping blob on the front seat, we boys started a spontaneous plan to get even with her. Peeing in a cup was suddenly the funnest thing that could possibly happen on a car trip, and Mary was not allowed to take part. I think Mary had a few tears in addition to the Dramamine to help her fall asleep that time. It seems like we boys had to go pee a lot on that trip. Watching the pee stream across the outside of the rear windows was our entertainment. Over the span of that trip, and some others, we boys became aware of several fine points of cup dumping physics. A cup held just right at the right angle and with the right speed would explode out of the cup on its own. Always dump to the rear of an open window to avoid splashback. Never dump when a large truck is passing you in either direction. And by a certain age, peeing in a cup was no longer necessary due to your bladder size. But in a family with 6 boys spanning 12 years, the practice of the cup endured. I remember one trip where a woman in a passing car, one of those rare passing lanes, stared and stared into our wagon and kept gesturing as she spoke, animatedly to her husband and 1 child. I was old enough at this point to gather that she found a family with 5 or 7 children clambering about in a station wagon somewhat unacceptable. "Why is that lady staring at us, Mommy?" one of us had asked. Mom took a minute to consider. "She probably can't believe how happy and well-behaved you all look. Make sure you smile at her and wave." We did. Although we saw that same car several times during the rest of that day, the woman refused to meet our eye. Oh, and yes, the first thing my dad did when we got to our arrival destination was to wash at least the rear half of the station wagon.
Sara Lepley is a senior at Virginia Tech studying public relations and creative writing. She started writing stories when she was a little kid and never stopped. Sara finds writing poetry offers her a way to work out and better understand some of the issues in her life. Here is Sara Lepley and her poem, "I See You in Shakespeare."
I see you in Shakespeare. For centuries, men teased whores with prospects of marriage, so you understand how it torments me when 3 days later, I still haven't heard from you, how Cassio's empty assurances echo your own. But like Bianca, I let hope hallow me of my mind's better faculties until I make enough room for you to come in. Reveling in the ridiculous, we played at conversations like improv. When I asked where on a date you would take me, you said to see the diamond rainstorms on Saturn. Like Desdemona to Othello, I saw my world in you. I did not know you saw dating me as equally improbable, just another exercise in seeing what you could make me believe. The Venetian merchant knew to send stock to more than one port. Friends advise, don't make yourself so available, play the game. But I love the song you wake up to. the way you traced my body and called it perfect, how we both find humor in dark places. And even though you only deal out maybes and perhaps, giving you up is the only thing that feels like a risk.
Petting and walking the dog, playing music, swimming, drinking coffee, reading pointless articles are just a few of the diversions Charlie Katz uses to avoid writing. Other suggestions are welcome because sometimes he ups and writes anyway. Here's Charlie Katz and his poem, Still Life.
Still life. There's a stillness in them, these veterans sitting over their coffee in the corner booth, under the painting of river and field and spare winter dress of refracted gray and wilted brown. A river no one crosses, a field no wind disturbs, at the Sweet Tooth Bakery that offers a buffet lunch in a couple of hours. They'll be gone then, these still assembled bones and flesh. But now they huddle over the table, corralling ceramic mugs, not drinking, not wanting the coffee to cool, waiting for time to stand aside until they are ready. Did they remember today to forget the body whose great-grandparents waved sisters and brothers off to America, while they remained in the old country, comfortable with their traditions, family and small dreams, hoping that hunger and pogrom would pass them by? Did they remember to forget the flak and Messerschmitts over Berlin, the ordnance of disorder, and the rubble of lives below? Did they remember to forget falling face down in the sand, breath expelled by the weight in the pack, rifle butt jammed into a cheek, chamber primed and barrel eternally cool, while men across the field and men alongside exploded? Have they remembered to forget the sons who returned as dog tags and a knock on the door, and the men who will know their children only as dust knows dust? Have they surrendered this moment of success or failure they can never confess to the sweet spell of too long ago? Or does the silence comfort them, these veterans of forgetting, like a grandmother's quilt? Does it enfold them in the stitched up patterns of old fabric that once was young? What are they saying to us, we who read the history they created, who walk past, waiting for them to be ready to speak? What words have they stowed on fragile parchment scrolls in the dim attic only they can unlock? There's a stillness in them, these veterans, rising with their laconic goodbyes, limping through prosthetic days toward the ground that calls them still.
Kathleen Chadwick is a fiction writer, mostly short stories, but she is currently at work on a novel about the lives of the Wardlaw sisters, known locally as the Black Sisters. Kathleen has a baccalaureate degree in English and an MFA in fiction writing from George Mason University. Welcome, Kathleen Chadwick and her prose offering, Who is Elvis?
Who is Elvis? My name is David Jackson. I work as an investment manager for a bank in Houston, Texas, and I was at work when the call came through from my father. It was a loud and garbled rant, but the gist was, we were having a family meeting. Family meeting. One of those have-to events where everyone gets together and decides a certain family member, for their own good and the good of the family, must take a certain action. Well, we had one of those. I took off work, flew home, and participated, well, more like observed, that round table discussion of discontent. My father bellowed, and my mother sat quietly, as usual. This was a scene that had played itself out before in our household, but never over so serious a matter. In the past, my brothers and I had always been the focus of these so-called family meetings. As kids, we always thought of them as Dad's master of the grand gesture meetings. In theory, they were called in order to reach a joint and rational consensus on a course of action. In reality, they were discuss something that I or one of my brothers had done or not done, and my mother had not handled to Dad's satisfaction. So we all gathered to listen to him. In the end, there had always been a whole lot more dictate than discussion. But this time, no one seemed to know for sure what the decision should be or how it should be decided. As it turned out, it wasn't my father or the family who made the decision. In the end, it was my mother. She made the decision. She had herself committed. She packed her bag, made all the arrangements at a private psychiatric hospital, kissed each of us, and with a sad smile whispered, "I think I need a rest." A friend came to help her, and we all stood stunned, watching through the front screen door as they drove away. "Arrest!" my father screamed after her. His face was red and his voice an ugly caricature of hers. "Arrest from what? I won't tolerate this behavior." For him, this behavior only further supported his contention that his wife, my mother, had finally gone completely nuts. Went to the funny farm, checked into the loony bin. It had to happen, he said. Crazy is in her family. She hasn't been right in years. He sat with his head in his hands after she left and said, "There's always that possibility, you know, if you remember her sister, your crazy Aunt Margaret." Well, it was true, there was Margaret, and we did all call her, though not to her face, Crazy Aunt Margaret. I thought until I was 5 years old that, in fact, her first name was Crazy. But my mother told me Margaret wasn't really crazy, just a bit eccentric and somewhat confused. In my mother's family, eccentricity was not considered a detriment, more an asset carried to an extreme. It was her confusion that was her problem, my mother said. Margaret was a saver. It was always the rainy days she worried about. And in her confusion, she never learned the difference between when to save and when to savor. My mother told me the story of how Margaret went to a birthday party when she was 6 and brought home a piece of birthday cake. It was yellow cake with pink and blue flowered frosting. She wanted to save it for later, and she didn't want anyone else to get it, so she put it under a pillow that night for safekeeping. For most of us, that would have been a lesson learned, but not Margaret. She just found better hiding places. People just become more who they are as they get older, my mother said. That was certainly true of Margaret. The trait carried through her whole life. She taught piano lessons and was considered a classic spinster. My grandfather left a trust to her when he died, and his house. So the family knew she was taken care of, but no one knew how much she had or what she did with the money. Most of what she used throughout her life was cast off. Late relative and early goodwill, that's what everyone said. Often she looked like a street person, so when it wasn't Crazy Margaret, it was poor Crazy Margaret. 10 years ago, on a beautiful sunny afternoon, she died of a brain hemorrhage. 1 minute she was talking on the phone, the next she was dead. My mother and her sister Louise cleaned out the old house. They found over $165,000 in small bills and change, hidden in coffee tins, under the couch, beneath the mattress, and in holes in walls behind pictures. 20 years of saving. The two sisters sat on the floor and divided the money between them like they were playing cards. Go fish or old maid. Every time they reached another $10,000, they slugged back on bourbon they drank straight from jelly jars. And they toasted Crazy Margaret. Between the finding, the counting, and the toasting, they were pretty much hammered for over a week. Fortunately, my father was out of town on business and never heard any of it. My mother gave me her share of the money in a pillowcase and told me to take care of it for her, that she might need it someday. It wasn't bourbon that got my mother committed. Dad says she went off. She even tried to injure him. That's what he said. I went to visit her at the hospital after she was there for a short time. She was expecting me and was sitting in the patient's lounge looking out the window when I arrived. Look, she said. She pointed to a lush wildflower garden in a frenzy of color splayed around a small pool. A fountain spurted water over rocks that looked as if they had just sprung from the ground. Isn't that just the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, she asked. Your father would never allow such a garden at the house. He says lawns are supposed to be trim and edged and flowers are in borders. He says anything that grows with that kind of abandon is just a weed. My mother turned her head slowly from the window. I'm glad you came to see me. How are Alex and Bo? Alex is mother's dog and Bo is her cat. They're fine, I said. They're with me. The truth is, Dad can't stand Mom's pets, and he never did understand why Mom named the dog Alex. And he says there's something very strange about naming Bo, the cat, after a dead man, especially since no one is certain who killed him. My mother met Mrs. Beauregard Rothschild when she was doing volunteer work a few years ago at the same hospital where she is now. It seems Mrs. Rothschild found her husband, Bo, lying face down in a pool of blood. There was a large hole in his head caused by a very large gun. Whatever happened, she claimed no memory of the event. It was possible, she said, he had ties to unsavory characters. That's what she told her lawyers. But it was also possible she knew exactly what happened to Bo. Her family suspected the latter, and so she was at the hospital. Mother said Mrs. Rothschild seemed quite happy with how it all turned out. But how are you doing? I asked her. I'm fine, David. They have a nice library, and I have time to do what I want. Yes, of course, but how do you really feel? Dad says before the incident, you hardly ever cooked, and you let the dishes pile up in the sink for days at a time while you just sat reading. And this all started because suddenly you wanted to go back to school. My mother sighed deeply. The air seemed almost too heavy for her to breathe. She smoothed unseen wrinkles from her skirt. David, this did not all start because of school. It started a long time before that. It's true, I haven't wanted to cook for a while. I realized I was just sick of looking at all that meat. But you know your father, he wants his meat and potatoes. He's got to have his dinner every evening after the news and during his TV game show. And don't talk to him while he's watching, especially not during that game show. And I didn't, not in the last 5 years. You mean you haven't talked in 5 years? Talked. I suppose we talked at each other. We just stopped talking to each other. Geez, Mom, what the hell's going on? I knew your marriage wasn't great, but if it was so bad, why did you stay? Habit, I guess, not wanting to admit to mistakes. In the beginning, we were both busy trying to find our lives, but it seems life is what happens when you're out looking for it. The trouble is, we ended up looking in opposite directions. By then, we had 3 kids, and one day at a time, 40 years passed. But how could you not talk about it? At first, I tried. I think we both tried. Then I didn't, and he didn't. I think your father felt the quiet meant it was settled.